about practically addressing some of the practical problems around freedom of religion and belief and matters of concern that that we all know and we have had highlighted very visibly to us over the past 20 minutes. And the question which I want to pose, and it genuinely is an open-ended question, is that if what I'm about to describe can be made to work and to help in relation to torture, can it work in relation to freedom of religion and belief too? And this is a question I've thought about a little bit from time to time. There was a chapter in another book I wrote that was reflecting on this a little while ago. And the answer is I'm not entirely sure. But I think it's something that requires a bit of reflection, and we have a little time, not a lot, but I can tell this story quite quickly. I was chair of a body called the UN is full of terrible acronyms. Life is full of terrible acronyms. And this was known as the OPCAT. Yeah, I know. It stands for the Optional Protocol to the UN Convention Against Torture. Let's not worry about what it's called, or indeed that I chaired a body with arguably the worst title in the world of the UN, called the SPT, the Subcommittee on Prevention of Torture, because it wasn't a subcommittee of anything whatsoever. It was just a drafting error, but we don't correct errors, do we? What it did was establish a body of 25 elected members from state parties around the world, which, unlike other UN treaty bodies, had the mandate and the power to visit any place of detention wherever they wish in those now 92 countries, to see and speak to anyone they like to report to the state and local government and recommend what should be done. So basically, we had a mandate to choose whichever countries we wished to within our system, which is about 90, to decide if we wanted to visit them. If we did, to go there at a time of our choosing. The state could say, we don't want to see you, to which we said, well, fascinating but irrelevant, we're coming anyway. And when we get to the country, we don't tell them what we do, we just decide where we're going. Have you literally tried turning up at a police station? Police stations are easy, you can walk into police stations all the time. Prisons, they have an open door policy, they used to bring in people in. Prisons are a little bit more tricky. Prisons are a little bit more tricky because they are designed on the whole to keep people out. And when you go there and you sort of say, oh right, how do we get into this when they're not meant to know we come? Well, we found our ways. But literally, you rock up at a police station, ring the doorbell and say, hi, we're from the UN, let us in, please. And they go, oh, right, okay. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that was basically the way it worked. It was quite remarkable, is quite remarkable. It happens as we speak. The key difference to every other, and this is a relevant point, to all the other UN mechanisms that we've described, UPR, treaty bodies, special rapporteurs with their reports, it's all confidential. Why? Basically, the negotiating price that had to be paid for extraordinary levels of access to places and an ability to see what most states would wish nobody to see was the requirement that it be kept confidential. Some say this defeats the entire purpose of human rights, which is all about, what's the language we always use? Shining a light, transparency, openness, accountability. We believe in all these things, yet we did none of this. The view that motivates much human rights work, we've heard it, I've said it, others have said it in this room this afternoon, is that public criticism is vital in order to bring about change, but public criticism also does something else. It results in public defense, public denial, particularly when it comes from prominent international organizations. You don't want to be criticized by these people, so you tell them that they're not telling the truth, they don't understand their sources. What you can never do is turn around and accept that they might be telling you the truth. And I've plenty of experience of this when working in a confidential capacity at the end of our visits, and I'll Our visits were confidential. The fact that we went wasn't. They were very, very visibly public. People say, you do confidential visits. I said, have you ever tried confidentially to turn up in front of a prison or walk around a police station? You know, for people thinking I haven't got a Harry Potter invisibility cloak at my disposal. These were very, very, very public things, but the results were confidential. And that made all the difference in the world to the states concerned. And often at the end of a visit, I would be talking to people and say, you do know X, Y, and Z. And how often did they ever deny the reality of what I said we had seen and what we felt needed doing? Almost never. Could this material ever receive the light of day? Oh, yes, it could. The states were free to publish the reports that we produced and the recommendations that contained within them, if they wished. We encouraged them to do so, of course we did. Would they ever? Over half of them have been, which is interesting. They weren't written to be published, but they have been because the states thought ultimately it was better that they did. But if they didn't want to, they didn't need to be. This completely changed the dynamic of how you went about dealing with human rights matters with states. Private discussions, much more honesty from both sides. In my experience, too many international human rights bodies, activists and others feel the need to denounce. I assure you, I have plenty of times felt the need to denounce, to scream from the rooftops at many of the things that I've seen. But what's it going to achieve? Sometimes it achieves a lot. Sometimes it is all that you can do, and achieving it is absolutely all that you can do, so that is what you achieve. In other occasions, as we said before, in reply to certain questions, it can do inestimable harm. When can it actually make a difference to make things better? And that was the question that one always came back to. If you were working, as we were, to try to prevent, not hold people to account, but to prevent people from being ill-treated, and it was a very distinct mandate, working confidentially, would never see the light of day if the state which you were engaging with you didn't win their trust or win their interest. What did you do? Well, we did it in a different way to the top line, approaches. We went into places of detention. We tried to identify at a very practical, granular level what were the real problems that were being seen. Obviously, some of them were self-evident. You needed to talk to nobody at all, or so you thought. But quite often, you could see things that you thought were the problem, and when you talked to the people concerned, when you talked to the detainees, when you talked to the victims, were these necessarily the things that were the most concern to them? Not always. What was really the problem? We talked to victims. We didn't project our concerns onto victims, or at least we tried not to. A classic one could be, overcrowding, terrible overcrowding in places of detention. We think this is absolutely terrible, and I can assure you in many places it is. But to some detainees, there might be things worse than being in an overcrowded prison cell, and that might be in solitary confinement. You need to work out what actually is the solution to the problem that you actually see, and then map that onto what actually can be achieved within that particular situation. And much of what we did was never ideal, but you have to ask yourself, is what we are doing making things better than they were, and is better enough? And almost always, yes, it is. It was also important we quickly realised to recognise that not everyone that you were engaging with, when you were dealing particularly in country with people responsible for running places of detention, wanted a fight. They weren't all necessarily monsters doing terrible things to people. Most of the time, not all, but most of the time, they were people working in prison systems, in military, in detention systems, in policing systems, who, for a variety of reasons, were trying to do their job, doing it terribly badly, were not set up to do it any better, and often had very little choice other than to do some of the terrible things that they knew full well that they were responsible for doing. Not all of them were terrible people. Many of them wanted to do things better, but they had no opportunity to do so, and were very keen to enlist our support as members of the international community to advocate or to voice their concerns about why they didn't want things to be the way they were either. And so that, again, sometimes we don't always think in all the situations that we are dealing with. There is a temptation, and sometimes we know it's absolutely correct, to paint those in authority as the people who are responsible for what's going on, but certainly at a more granular operational level, they often can just be caught up in situations too, and simply have to do whatever they are required to do, even though it may not necessarily be what they want. After all, in some of the worst places we ever went in, these were the conditions in which the people working there worked as well. It was home for them and their daily lives as much as it was for the detainees who were living there. Sometimes something that we often forget, and they couldn't. But it also meant we also had to be realistic about what you could recommend and try to do if you wanted to effectively bring about change. You've got to be realistic about what those in charge can and cannot do. And that begs a question too. Who really is in charge in relation to a given issue at a given place? Coming from where I do, we tend to assume that prison authorities run prisons, except that in many countries, most of the time, they don't. Detainees run prisons. Or they have a very strong degree of influence, or some of them do, over what goes on in prisons. And you can talk to those responsible for prisons till you are blue in the face. And will you be able, you can get them to promise the earth. And will it happen? No, it won't, because they haven't got the first ability to control what's actually going on at a day-to-day level within those places. The number of times I've been into cell blocks in some notorious prisons, and we say, well, we're going to go in there because we want to have a look and talk to people. The authorities, in all seriousness, say, be my guest, but you do need to know that if you do, we are not coming in there to help you if you get into trouble. You know, on your own head be it, up to you. And that was pretty common, more common than I ever would have thought. Be realistic about who is in charge, who can bring about change. And that operates everywhere. The number of state authorities I have spoken to, with all the panoply and dignity of the state, the minister of this, the minister of that, the representative of the other, their authority doesn't barely run further than the end of their departments. And their ability to actually influence what's happening on the grounds to real people and the forces that they officially exercise authority over is often considerably less than even they believe it to be. And they often understand it to be considerably less than they pretend. But part of the panoply of international life is this pretense that states actually control what goes on within their own territories. And sometimes that is frighteningly true to an nth degree. In many others, it is terribly untrue. And you can spend a lot of time talking to the wrong people because the people you're engaging with really can't make the difference function and make them work in the situations we're faced. But that's how we try to gain credibility as a confidential body, by being able to get close to that problem. And yes, confidentiality was quite helpful to us at times because it could mask or at least put under wraps the extent to which we were prepared to say, well, we know you can't do this, we know you can't do that, we know you should, but at least you can do the other. So how about starting there, shall we? It's not right, but it would make a difference. It was a completely different way of trying to bring about change. Don't ask governments and states to do things that are, we said don't ask to do things that we know you can't do. Call for great legislative change. How difficult it is to change legislation in many or most of the countries that we come from. Very difficult. It will take years to change the law in the UK on a given matter. And yet we blindly expect other countries to be able to change it like that. And if they can, well, that's a problem, isn't it? It tells you a great deal about what you really need to know about the fragility of the rule of law. And yet we suddenly seem to think when they say, oh yes, we changed it overnight, what a great win. Well, probably not, because of what it betokens about what the real nature of what is being done actually is. But from a, from a practical perspective, it was always necessary to try to think yourself, what's the real problem? What is the driver? what could be done, what would be a practical solution. And the result was often things that didn't look like human rights outcomes at all. But could they make a real difference? Yes, they could. A very practical example to try to illustrate. I can't name the country because the report is still confidential, but there we are. A very, very poor country. Conditions in prisons, absolutely terrible. We visit the prison, go into cell blocks. You don't want me to describe in great detail what they were like, but they were appalling. And that's the politest word I can think of. What was worse was that most of the people in there hadn't been out of their cell block that we went into for about 6, 7, 8 weeks. Very hot country, dark rooms, their eyesight was already going, terrible skin diseases. Even if they could look out the window, some of them couldn't because of the effect of the light on their eyes. They were others were still desperate to be let outside. International rules say you should have an hour outdoor exercise, a minimum every day. Why wasn't this happening? Why didn't we demand that there should be an hour out of cell time as a minimum every day for every one of these prisoners who were suffering terribly by being locked up in the way they were? It was pretty obvious, really. It was a very remote prison, very simple design. You know, a perimeter wall, the cell blocks inside, and if they had gone out of the cell blocks, the only place they could exercise was between the cell blocks and the outer wall, except that the gate had fallen off the outer wall. So if anyone was let out of their cell block in this remote location, the less than 4 guards in the place couldn't have prevented anybody from just walking straight out of the door. It's the only place I'd ever been to where the recommendation that we had to make for allowing people to have more time out of their cell was get better gates. You won't find that in any human rights handbook, but it was the only thing that was even going to begin to make that situation better. And I could repeat endless examples of that nature. Now, how does this translate over into the context of religion and belief? An approach in which what we do is think a little bit less about what the top line commitments are, what are the obligations, but actually speaking to the groups on the ground. And of course, as Baptists and the communities we have, this is something we should be very good at, knowing what's really going on within our communities, within our congregations. But to find out what are the real practical problems that they're actually facing, not necessarily projecting what we think the problems are onto others, and more importantly, in your situation, what would something like a decent solution actually look like? Because it may not be what we intuitively, particularly as outsiders, as human rights advocates, as lawyers, might actually think is the answer. And then work with them to see, well, how could this be achieved? What might a solution look like here? And then being able to take something that is more granular, more practical, more doable to those in authority, when you've identified who those people might be, to try to say, well, at least couldn't this be done? It may not be the answer to all that problem, but it might help a little bit. Now, sometimes this is never going to work. Sometimes it might. To give an example, we all know that there have been problems. I used to do a lot of work some years ago to do with registration requirements in many post-Soviet countries in Eastern Europe, the laws on registration, which were terribly difficult for many Baptist communities. Why? Some because they were designed to be terrible. Others were not necessarily intended to be terrible, but they simply worked on a received set of assumptions about what a religious organization looked like. That it would be hierarchical, that each would have a certain number of members, that it would have a certain governance structure, and to get your registration, you had to submit all this information to the authorities in order to do it, which for many worked fine, but for many Baptist communities didn't work fine at all. The individual nature of congregations might mean you couldn't pass a numerical threshold, for example. The systems of governance you had didn't relate to an approved hierarchy with a higher body stamping off this, that, and the other. And when you explain this to some of the local authorities, they say, well, that's not a problem, but we didn't know that's the way these things work. Sometimes they did, and that was the very point, to get at such communities. But sometimes it isn't. There are just assumptions about the way that things are put together, which if you then have those conversations in a different way, not necessarily at this point accusing people of something, but trying to see whether you can actually broker a change, often at a low level, not necessarily at legislative level, but maybe in bureaucratic practice or through regulation, that is much easier to bring in. Then you can do things that, if not at least solving a problem, can actually help it. And this was, the way in which, we went about our work in relation to torture. We could do that, I suppose, because there were other bodies within the UN that took a different approach. You could say, good cop, bad cop. Were we the good cops to other people's bad cops, or the other way around? I don't know. Who was letting who off the hook? I don't think anybody was. Different approaches for different contexts. Now, such an approach absolutely doesn't work everywhere. You have to assess it on a country-by-country basis, on an issue-by-issue basis, to work out what may or may not work. It doesn't take a genius, if you look at the countries who were a party to our system, that there were some which we never bothered to visit at all. These are some of the worst countries. But why? Our approach would never have any traction there. There's simply not enough levels of the rule of law, not enough authority, not enough governmental control to make these sort of things doable. But in many countries there were. So we focused on those where we thought what we were mandated to do could actually make a difference. Could this approach work in relation to all human rights issues? Possibly not. And this is the question that I have. Could it clearly and perhaps amazingly did a lot of good in relation to the ill treatment of people in detention? Is it transposable? Could you think of such a thing, or such different approaches to the normal ones that we use that could be beneficial in the context of freedom of religion and belief? I just don't know. What you do need is, I would say, third-party interlocutors from country situations who can approach this objectively. The difficulty is with people are not very objective about it. It raises passions on both sides, which perhaps arguments about torture doesn't. When you raise questions of torture with state authority, I have never yet met, as I've said, an authority that said it's okay to torture people. They deny it, they say it isn't happening, they challenge the source. When you go and speak to people about freedom of religion and belief, and you say, these are the problems which these people are suffering, they can't get their churches registered, they're having their churches demolished, they're suffering violence and intimidation, so often the answer comes back is, yeah, that's fine. There isn't that same starting point. And that in part goes back to what I said earlier about there being the lack of a very clear, agreed international, should we say, normative framework. Against all this, I do feel that there is something about the nature of religious belief, religious organizations, that means that it ought to be possible to consider building approaches which are, shall we say, more amenable to this more sort of reflective, dialogical, engaged approach, that is perhaps less confrontational, that is based on a principle of trying to understand where both sides of a dialogue are coming from, when you can get people together in good faith, perhaps within the confines that confidentiality can provide, where people can be a little bit more honest than might be possible, certainly in the international arena that we were speaking about earlier. At the end of the day, Geneva is an international diplomatic forum. And what happens in an international diplomatic forum matters. When I speak to ministers in their home countries, they are perfectly happy to tell me certain things or to admit to certain things which I know in Geneva they would never be allowed to do, because their permanent missions would say, you can't say that, it will undermine our leverage on X, Y, and Z in this political forum. And it's not going to happen. Taking the discussion out into the country, closer to the violation, closer to the people who are suffering the problem, closer to the place where the problem needs to be solved, is, I think, one of the challenges for the human rights movement, which in my view is Yeah, but all I was saying earlier about the importance of the UN, and it is, and regional organisations, can still be a long way, not only geographically, or conceptually, politically, and practically, from what the solutions might be that could make a real difference to people. So in conclusion, I would say that the lessons that I've learned from my working with torture is not to be overdriven by abstract standards. Look to what the real problems that people are facing are. Try to build and work on relationships that you can develop with countries. Though it hurts at times, try not to be, try to be non-confrontational and focus on the practical and what you can genuinely expect people to do, rather than what you feel ideally that they ought to be doing, when in truth, you surely must know that they can't. Will it solve all the problems everywhere? Clearly not. But it might solve some problems somewhere, some of the time. But not always. I'll conclude, because I know we'll finish with one, shall we say, sort of, anecdote, well, 2 points in conclusion. One is perhaps an illustrative anecdote about where this doesn't work. We were in one prison once, and there was a terribly, terribly overcrowded cell, horribly overcrowded. The cell next door to it was empty. So we simply said to them, why don't you take half the detainees out of that cell and put them in the cell next door? You would solve your problem overnight. To which the answer was, there is only one padlock. To which you say, well, get another padlock. To which the answer is, no budget for a padlock. What sort of idiot was I? Of course, I should have got that one, seen it coming. It was the next one I didn't see coming. I said, okay, that cell is actually bigger. Take everybody out of this one, put them in that one, and move the padlock from this cell to that one. Can't do that. Yeah, you know what's coming, don't you? It's that cell's padlock. At that point, you know there's nothing more you can do. And I have plenty of such examples. But if on one occasion they move the padlock, and if on another one they actually get another one, that's more realistic than new gates on the prison. But so it goes on. Actually trying to prevent ill treatment is very different from trying to determine whether there's a breach and holding someone to account and all the rest of it. But good human rights protection can involve incredibly granular things by those who know what can make a difference. And those of us who are working closely in communities where violations take place should know, or should be able to find out, what makes a difference and try to work whilst make that happen. So whilst, yes, we work at the top level, don't forget what can be done to make things better right down there, and don't write off what can be done right down there, because more, I think, can be done than we think if we're willing to challenge some of the assumptions about how the way we work and what looks like a human rights outcome. Anyway, I will finish there. Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm. It's gone. Yeah. Hello.
Hello. Oh yes. Thank you very much, Malcolm. We've probably just got time for one question, if there is a question in all that. So, and Brian.
Thank you so much for that very informative and very helpful presentation. It seems like some of these things are on the smaller local scale, the examples you've given. But where on earth do you begin in more recent, larger scale issues like the 1 million, 2 million, how many Uyghurs imprisoned in the torture camps in northern China, or the thousands upon thousands of Ukrainian children kidnapped into Russia at the present time? We can all say it's illegal.
Yeah.
But where on earth do you begin to try and address this stuff?
And in a sense, that's the conundrum. But the conundrum is not answered, is answered by having to think sometimes quietly, carefully, and dispassionately. And sometimes the word dispassionately is about the most difficult bit of that, about what the real points of leverage are, where you can possibly intervene, and with whom and what can make a difference. What are the organisations at your disposal? What are your links into the local communities? What are the nature of the relationships between local communities and those actually exercising authority in a given area? What are your communities' links with other communities operating locally, or other organisations that might have leverage or be listened to, even if you will not be? What is, to use a horrible expression, the mapping, in order to try to work out what will work? You take the top line you mentioned there. You could hardly think of two more difficult examples at the moment. Where you've got what appears to be a state policy of little short of mass extermination. Well, are you going to be able to talk constructively in the way that I mentioned? Of course you're not. That's not going to happen at that level unless you can get, should we say, political leverage at a very high level to make that space open. To go back to a question someone mentioned earlier, is that going to happen in relation to China? I don't think so. Can it happen in relation to some other countries? Yes, it can. There were, perhaps it shouldn't work, but shouldn't work this way, but there were numerous occasions when I was in the UN, we would explain our mandate to some countries and we think, well, if we signed up to that, we're not doing it, go away. And so you think, okay. And so then you look around, you remind people of, do you really want to be, seen to be the only country that doesn't do this? Sometimes you have to, phone a friend in another country that's gone through this and say, look, just explain to them it wasn't as bad as you think it was, that we've all come out and this is absolutely fine, and that you find ways of making sure what happens. But you can only do that when you've made the calculation that those sort of interventions can done. That actually takes a lot of knowledge. And we put a lot of effort into gaining knowledge about violations as organisations. Do we put enough into the knowledge about what the potential avenues of redress and remedy might be in order to be able to answer effectively that question, what can we do to make a difference? In many instances, and certainly the big, massive, flagrant ones, what can be done? Frankly, these sort of granular approaches, not a lot. At the same time, when you have got many vulnerable local communities, what actually can be done by trying to deal with some of their problems at a local level when it isn't necessarily hardwired into top-line government policy? And the answer is quite a lot. Because often, those in national authority don't want to see these problems. They don't want to make it an international issue or a problem for them if it's raised in other quarters. And so they simply will just say to the more local regional authorities, get your act together. But it's never been put to them in that way before. So it's all about trying to work out what actually can work in a given situation. And, that's not easy. But as I said, can you solve the big problems this way? No. But there again, do I think that such approaches to this, and going back to issues of torture, will we ever go to solve the mass political torture in some countries that have taken place in recent times this way? No, absolutely not. But in fact, most torture in the world doesn't happen that way. Most is slow, ordinary, boring, routine ill treatment and torture that takes place within systems because either the systems know no better or that they're not set up in a way that can make it better, and that's where you can make a big influence. And the same, I would hazard, is true in relation to religious freedom and enjoyment of religious liberty. When someone is out to persecute, are you going to stop them through this way? No. But where there are situations where there just are routine disabilities that really hamper the life of communities in living within the societies and the bureaucracies and the things that hamper